Hello and welcome back to the Potentia podcast. Today with us, we have Mitch and Aaron. Mitch and Aaron, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
Nice to
Thank
see you.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. So you both just recently published a paper. I know, Aaron, I've seen you do a lot of TV interviews lately. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're hearing in your world right now and what prompted you both to publish this paper?
Yeah, sure. No, so I think Mitch and I both came at this thinking about how really in the wake of the Trump-Xi summit in Beijing in the middle of May, it really felt like there was a shift in the narrative and the discourse around China, and kind of an opening of an opportunity. In some ways, this was born out of a kind of maybe sad or uninspiring reality that both countries, leaders of both countries, recognize that they're in a sort of mutually assured disruption. I think that's one of the helpful terms I've heard used to describe it, and basically a kind of a détente or a strategic stalemate where, for the time being, because each country can basically impose, intolerable economic pain on the other, whether it's, rare earth export controls from China on the United States, or it's advanced semiconductor export controls, tariffs, financial sanctions, exclusion from the global financial system by the United States against China. Neither country can tolerate that. So sort of by necessity, there is sort of a shift in thinking about, hopefully moving away from containment. And now, on the one hand, actually, what we've seen is that one possible response to the status to this sort of stalemate is both sides are going to try and race and gather as much leverage as they can against the other, and kind of do what we framed in the piece as decoupling 2.0. At least from the United States point of view, we've already seen some advocacy of, look, the key move right now is to make sure that in the future, China can't, impose export controls or, limit our access to that critical rare earths, and to seek out even more points of leverage that we can use to inflict pain on China. That's one option. But we also think, look, doing the same thing we already did to greater intensity is probably not a winning strategy. And the alternative path that we're trying to kind of open up with this piece is saying, look, actually, this is a moment for reflection, to look back on what worked and didn't work about earlier periods of U.S. China relations, and actually, find some economic opportunity that may actually not be zero sum, but that can still advance American interests in a way that is, compliant with a kind of rational, reasonable approach to national security, which we don't downplay, but we say, look, there's actually a lot of room in between zero risk tolerance and just opening the gates. Maybe I'll throw it over to Mitch also to add his view.
Well, no, I think that's right. I think Aaron's done a great job of summarizing it. We're in a new period. We're probably in a period, if you step back from just the Xi-Trump summit, what we're seeing is sort of a setup that's been years in the making, right? Where we went through the engagement period between 1972 and, you could argue, 2012. Well before Trump got into office, there were already huge rumblings that things were shifting from engagement to something else. And then, of course, they did shift into full-blown decoupling. Both countries looked at the realities and discovered that as much as they wanted to alleviate their dependence on the other, there were other risks, such as Aaron mentioned, exposure to global financial system restraints, exposure to rare earths constraints and other constraints. And not to mention the fact that China has now emerged not just as the world's leading manufacturing superpower and trading superpower, but also it has created a very dense, interconnected ecosystem, which makes it very difficult for other countries who wish to participate in the global manufacturing system to avoid China. So what I see is probably an evolution towards something that maybe more accurately reflects what President Nixon originally envisioned in 1972. No friends, no enemies, just business. Work together where you can. Try to alleviate your dependence on the other where you can, and then cross the river by feeling for the stones under your feet, as Deng Xiaoping said.
I mean, I think that we're on the same page there. I've seen a lot of these same signals, and you both put it really well in your papers. I think also looking back to other points in history to have these lesson points is quite useful. But I think since we're at this point, I was speaking with some other people. I spoke with an economist in Singapore the other day. He referred to it as fragmented globalization. In your paper, you talk about it as decoupling 2.0. I'm kind of in between both. I'm wondering when we're talking about, you brought up other countries, and then if we're looking at this from, say, a business perspective, even multinational corporations, if we have the emergence of a decoupled U.S. and China, like you said, we must operate within these, financial supply chain systems, manufacturing systems. How can countries and I guess companies operating in this environment think about it? I mean, in my mind, it's quite apparent that China has been trying to create its own type of legacy system. We have BRICS, other type of coalitions that it's been trying to build and also trying to get people on the yuan. But I'm wondering, how are you two looking at it? I mean, how can we look at navigating that realistically?
Well, I think, in some ways, the first thing is just to face up to it and to recognize it. And we may all be on the
Hmm.
same page here, but I still think there's a lot of denialism out there about
Yeah.
sort of what game China is playing. I think and we say this and have written this not as people who are in any way downplaying the challenge that China's economic and geopolitical and military rise poses to the United States, to other industrialized countries, to its neighbors, but as just a cold, sober assessment of the reality, which is that, um, you know, diversifying its supply chains and making itself integral to the economic system of well over a majority of well over 50% of the countries of the world is the central pillar of China's strategy. And so, I think, I separately wrote another piece maybe a month or two ago. I think the title was Putting China on an Axis of Chaos Underestimates China. The point being, right, so the axis of chaos, this is this idea quite popular, I think, in Washington, D.C., that, China is part of this axis of kind of global spoilers with Russia, Iran, North Korea, sometimes Venezuela,
Hmm.
so-called CRINK, C-R-I-N-K, right? And, there's no denying that there is real collaboration and alignment between those countries. And I think it's foolish anyone who says, oh, no, there's nothing going on there. Like, they're not seeing the full story either. But you can't understand the game that China is playing if you're only looking at it in terms of, oh my God, they're on the same side as our enemies, and therefore they are committed to our downfall and spoiling things for the United States. China is playing, if you want to put China on the axis of chaos, you have to put it on like 10 other axes as well. And that is the name of the game for China. It's diversification to enable its, self-sufficiency and, kind of autarky. And so, I think one thing that we're interested here then in moving forward is also that actually gives multinationals and American firms actually surprising opportunity, because China really needs to maintain itself as integrated into the global economy. And so, there's actually some leverage there if we adopt, what we think is a more strategic and productive position, rather than, again, this sort of like China equals bad binary thinking. Mitch?
Yeah. So China's always been a Rorschach test for the viewer, right? If you want to see an economy about to collapse, and there's plenty of evidence that China has demographic issues, it has institutional sclerosis, it has all those problems. The military seems to be in a constant state of flux lately. I mean, if you want to find reasons to feel really good about the U.S. position and really bad about the China, there's plenty of evidence for that. If you want to see China as an unstoppable juggernaut out to Sinoform the world, and dunking on the U.S. On a monthly basis, you could find plenty of evidence for that too. And the reality is, both conditions exist at the same time. And so the challenge for the U.S. side is to get over the idea of trying to define China as one way or the other, and to accept that if you're going to deal with China, it would really be helpful now in this phase, the call it the post-engagement, post-decoupling world that we're coming into. It would be really helpful now to, look at China sort of like a scientist would look at China, without the emotion, without the ideology, without the unhelpful binary constructs, which people don't understand very well. But whether you're a hawk or a dove, or you're an owl like me and Aaron, there's always the need for the middle view. And what we're trying to do is to show that it's a new era. I'll give you an example. You mentioned the industrialized countries and how we're going to address this. What most people in the industrialized world don't realize is that the majority of global growth, both GDP growth and population growth, is not happening in the industrialized world at this point. In fact, on a PPP basis, the BRICS countries are far more in the ascendant than the industrialized countries are. And that means that we could be looking through the looking glass at ourselves as a future Soviet bloc, while we think of ourselves as a set of countries that is trying to avoid spoilers. It could actually be that we're the ones that are sort of hemming ourselves in, and what might look like the administration making concessions that some might argue were unwise. One could also argue that they were just practically looking at the negotiating setup and deciding that, no, actually, this is time for something new. All of this is happening against the backdrop of the 21st century technologies that are defining the time we're in. And that's something that people constantly forget, that these old playbooks that we've used, the Cold War playbook and playbooks that go back, always seem to assume a binary zero-sum mentality. And people assume that if we're not arguing in favor of that, that we must be in favor of a win-win world. And that's not what Aaron and I argue. I don't think either of us are under any illusions about the idea of, a kumbaya world and what the likelihood of that happening. But there has to be something more mature that takes place soon, because these kinds of strategies that we've deployed in the last 15 years have been very impractical for U.S. interests. And that's just an objective fact. And so whether you like or don't like what China's doing, there has to be new thinking that comes into how we're approaching this. And that's what Aaron and I are trying to do. We're actually trying to bring new thinking, which we think that corporate America is desperate for. I think there has been a certain amount of Stockholm syndrome that has set in amongst the Fortune 500 on China, where they don't necessarily, in their heart of hearts, if you talk to Apple or NVIDIA or Oracle or Facebook or any of the Magnificent Seven leaders, none of them would say that decoupling is feasible or advisable from the U.S. point of view.
Completely agree. I was just taking down notes. I mean, there are just so many things that talking with you guys is making me think of. I want to make sure that just in my mind from both of you speaking, 4 points came up that I would love to address. We can either address them all together or one by one. We'll probably have to break them up. But I mean, we're talking about, so the paper is published in U.S. China Perception. So I want to get and we spoke about this in terms of the perception of the U.S. towards China, vice versa. I was talking with some Chinese subsidiaries. I guess it's Singapore-based, but Alibaba subsidiary. And they're doing market entry into the U.S. right now. And this type of détente environment is actually quite exciting to them. They were super excited about it. And at the same time, we were having a conversation over Peking duck, and I go, there's still the political environment of the U.S. that you have to consider, as well as the regulatory environment for technology specifically. So they do have a little bit of an uphill battle there. But I thought it was quite interesting that with the Trump-Xi summit, as well as just the way negotiations have been going, although they have been volatile, they have been more business-like in nature, as you pointed to, which actually many of the Chinese I found have welcome, at least in the business sense, which was quite interesting. So I guess the first point there, though, is before we get more into actionable advice for U.S. sanctions policy, so forth, so on, the three main points that, I would love for us to talk about initially, just off of what you both have spoken is, so we have the framing of the Trump-Xi summit. We had the introductions of this Thucydides narrative, which was quite poetic. And then everyone jumps on it, and then Trump rejects it, which, he had to at some point. Otherwise, it's an interesting narrative that we're buying into. I'm also not necessarily sunshine and rainbows. I consider myself more pragmatist. But with that in mind, there is still this Cold War mentality, which you both alluded to. I mean, I remember the first time when I was in Washington, D.C., to be fair, my first boss was a complete hawk. So, there's that. But I have noticed that in the operations of government, it's either you're very much a hawk and we're afraid of the communists, or, and they decry socialism, so forth, so on. Or then we have the people that are, I would argue, a bit naive, maybe in terms of China's goals for the world. It really just depends on the framing. But I think if you could speak to kind of the event of what happened with that framing, your guys' take on it, and why do you think we still have this hangover, essentially? Why are we holding on to it? Who wants to take it first? Okay.
Well, I mean, a couple things. The Hawks are not wrong in many of the things that they believe. That's the first thing I'll always say when I am asked a question about the Hawks. Their prescriptions are often biased by emotion and ideology and subjectivity, but their base ideas are not incorrect. I mean, the Chinese are not Boy Scouts. I mean, my mentor, Sidney Rittenberg, spent 16 years in a Chinese prison, mostly for things that had nothing to do with anything he did. He was accused of being a spy by Stalin, so Mao threw him in jail for 6 years during the early years of the post-1949 China era. And then again, during the Cultural Revolution for 10 years, where he was in solitary confinement. So, I mean, no illusion. But on the other hand, it just doesn't help to use old thinking for a new problem. And what we have is a new problem. We've never encountered a country like China. They're not so easily reduced to just an authoritarian, totalitarian, regime, or whatever the language that people like to use. It's all reductive. It's all, I do find it interesting as a sidebar note that if you were to talk to senior policy officials in Beijing and senior policy officials in Washington, one of the only things they can agree on is that the other country is failing. They're sure of it, and they know that it's just a matter of time. Well, you mentioned the Thucydides trap. I find that a very interesting analogy. I happen to know Professor Allison quite well, and he's a wonderful educator and a great mind for these matters. But I will say one thing: all of his examples involved a Western power challenging a Western power. There is something to be said for Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns. There are things that are outside of the experience set of the Washington intelligentsia. They're just, and I don't care how you want to put it. It doesn't make me a panda hugger to say that there are things about Sun Tzu, The Art of War, that they need to understand at a deeper level than the linear, binary thinking that they're approaching. They approach China and this competition with the kind of thinking which actually got us here. And what they don't realize is that they have a lot more in common with the doves than they would like to admit, because both doves and hawks are emotional in how they approach China. The hawks thought that if they just treat China the way they want it to be, they can change China in its image. And the doves felt that if you could just engage enough with China, then they'll become more like us. And let's be honest, both were equally fantastical in retrospect. And when I was vice chair of AmCham China, we were lobbying in favor of China's accession to the GATT, the predecessor to WTO. We were very clear about saying that they would never change, that they were never going to become more like us, that they probably wouldn't follow any of the things they agreed. And yet we were arguing in favor of it because the idea was either bring them into the system and work with them, or have them outside the system and have them possibly become North Korea times 10,000, because we saw where they were going with their industrial ecosystem. And we knew that we had to bring them in somehow. Still in a better position than we would have been. But the Hawks would argue otherwise. So yeah, I'll stop there. But I mean, I could say a lot more about that, and we should talk more about it. Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways, I think the Cold War narrative, as much as it evokes, you know, scary, difficult memories for many people and very violent ones in other parts of the world, I think there's a kind of comfort to it because it's familiar and it's in some ways it is it's not a relief, but it is at least it's easier to process the world if you go through it thinking, there are good guys and bad guys, and we're in this kind of Manichaean struggle. And the reality is that, it may be both that China as a country, as a system, is not the same as the Soviet Union. And also, even if it were the same or separate from that identity or lack thereof, the context is just totally different. And the global economy, even the political system is so much more integrated. I mean, technology connects everyone and everything, supply chains. So it's just it's a kind of wish casting for a familiar problem. No one's saying it's an easy problem, but it's at
I
least a
like that.
problem that we got through. And I think there's a kind of an American reflex to frame it in a quasi-religious to put it in quasi-religious terms. And it's we got to get them or else the worst thing will happen. And actually, I think it's very hard to. I mean, we're finally seeing some progress here, and this maybe to take it in a more optimistic direction. As much as again, look. So I mean, Mitch alluded to his immensely rich experience doing business on the ground in China. I mean, I come from an academic background and really haven't done a ton of field experience in China, but really studying what many people regard as the worst of China, ethnic policy and so on and so forth. So no one can accuse me, and I mean, I've published widely on these issues. I have pieces coming out shortly regarding the new ethnic law. So no one can really accuse me of holding back criticism or not talking about, the ugly side of things. So all of which is to say that, I don't have a lot of patience for people who only want to, tell well the story of China, 讲好中国的故事, right, as the propagandists have it. But the one advantage, I think, of the new appreciation for a lot of China's technological prowess, with the unitary robots and, we're seeing it with EVs, at least in other parts of the world, is we're getting over, I think, this very self-destructive, self-defeating idea that the game we're playing with China is containment rather than catch-up. And we need to recognize that, like, it's not just that, like, we're deciding between, do we let them have more or do we not let them have more? We're also deciding between, do we let ourselves have more from engaging with them or have less? And there are so many industries that are critical to having a great life in the 21st century that China is dominating in or poised to dominate in. And like, don't Americans want that? So, I think even if there's some obnoxious commentary and sort of tanky apologism, there's also hopefully some good stuff that will come of all this. And that is kind of the narrow, but I think very rich space that we're trying to push us toward.
No, I mean, I think this is all great. It's clear eyes going in. I think that the conversation that you two are really bringing to the forefront is, again, much more progressive than things I've seen. When I was in DC last, I spent 3 months there from November to January. And I mean, lovely, of course, but I feel like sometimes, the relationship between politics, we can, and, think tank world, it can kind of become just a maelstrom of echo chambers, the same words over and over without really looking for solutions. So I thought this was refreshing. With that in mind, before we move forward, I love the optimism. That's great. And I'm jealous. I'm sure that very enjoyable to grab a drink with you two. We can have, lots of stories to share from our experiences. But before we look at, you brought up mirroring. I'm actually speaking with someone else about that in terms of U.S. China-Iran relationship later this week, because it's a prevalent issue that the U.S. tends to impose on other governments, not always, but often in our relationships. But before we get to that, as well as just looking at things that we can control in terms of the U.S. policy environment, I would love to talk a little bit more about, both of you brought up what got us here in terms of for example, vulnerabilities with critical minerals. Japan didn't have the same vulnerability that the US did. When China pulled the plug, Japan said, go ahead. And the US was left high and dry. So that's kind of a discrepancy there in terms of preparedness of a country. And then, so that's from industrial layer, supply chain layer, and then also the policy layer. I'm wondering if either of you can speak to what got us to this point where we're not quite behind, but China is quite leapfrogging. Is it just the fact that we were lacking perception? Like, where in a policy realm did we have a disconnect in being prepared or unprepared?
Well, look, every system has its advantages. China's advantage is that it has two very powerful aspects to its governance system. One is vertical integration, and the other is unified command. Okay, we don't have either of those. We are sort of a salad, right? And that's always been our strength: is diversity and decentralization, and a thousand points of light. That's always been the U.S. But China's always been good at long-term planning, very long-term planning. And I was trading rare earths with Minmetals, the Chinese state-owned company, in 1992, and they were telling me about their plans to dominate rare earths. Okay, so for us to all of a sudden discover that rare earths are important in 2025. I talked about this in my Harvard Business Review article in August of 2024, and I sent it out to all my friends in Washington, and they all received it, and they all said, yes, this is very important. And it got into the very senior layers of the administration, that warning. And did it have any effect on trade war 2.0? No. Did they? I warned them about this. I mean, it didn't have to come to we knew this was going to be the result. The problem with reciprocity with China is that it's a race to the bottom. They will always win that because they're always willing to go to the mattresses more than we are. They have that ability. That has to do with a system where they can absorb a lot more stress and a lot more pain than Americans are prepared to accept. Our political system is not set up for that. So if the objective is to rebuild American capacity, our industrial capacity, supply chains, and have something where we're not under the thumb of another country, forget about which one. You don't want to be under the thumb of any country. The question isn't how do we keep China out at this point? No matter how much you think that's important, no matter how much you're afraid that they might weaponize EVs or whatever or become or create critical dependencies. We have a more immediate problem. We're gonna face relegation. Do you know that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, when they did their assessment of U.S. versus Chinese technology, they assessed, and they're an ultra hawkish group that used the top 10% of published papers that were cited, cross-cited. So it was a very, very objective process. And they determined that in something like 54 out of 63 categories of technology, China was either at level or in most cases ahead of the U.S. So we are playing catch up. And if the beginning of wisdom is calling things by their proper names, as Confucius said, then that's what we need to start doing. We need to start having these parallel universes where hawks believe one set of facts about China and then economists believe another set of facts about China. And that's what they prefer to have. So as long as we can't have a consensus, then we don't have to actually seriously address the problems. That works until it doesn't. Right now, we're at a place where the bigger question is, how do we bring in world-class manufacturing capability and all the underlying know-how? I mean, automation, robotics, advanced materials, advanced manufacturing techniques. All of those things underlie China's successes in the last 10 years in that sphere. We need those software modules uploaded immediately. We don't have time to figure it out ourselves. So we're not arguing that all the risks that hawks worry about aren't real, or that it's not somewhat of a danger to become helpful to China if you pursue some of these ideas. But the question really comes down to sort of the Dave Chappelle joke, when he was talking about how kids in Africa, some of them may be starving, but he still wants to eat lunch. I still want to have economic competitiveness regardless of how people in Washington view China. I still want the opportunity to compete head to head. And we're not going to do that if we're going to be too precious to engage the playbook that China engaged when it needed to reindustrialize. And it was very willing to bow low and do whatever was necessary. And we basically gave them access to many things in exchange for what we thought was the keys to globalization. Turned out it wasn't exactly the greatest idea in retrospect, but nonetheless, that's where things need to go. Much more practical, much more pragmatic. And I think we are going to see a much more pragmatic set of policies in the next 2 years. I was just at a set of meetings, an offsite in the West Coast, or the Old West, and I was very impressed with the level of
yeah.
Yeah, I was out of town, in Montana somewhere, and I was very impressed with the level of understanding that we need new thinking. But there was still an underlying reluctance to acknowledge the reality that we're facing, and that's the next thing that has to happen. And I don't know how many more times we have to have a deep seek moment before that happens, but when that finishes happening, we don't want companies to just then be figuring out their strategies. Companies need to be figuring out their strategies for when that occurs, because it's going to happen. And it's just a matter of time, because this is the writing on the wall. This is not going to change. This direction is now set, and it's much bigger than the Trump administration.
Any thoughts?
Hard to top what Mitch said. I'll just say that, how did we get to this sort of policy failure, or at least, incomplete success? I actually think, it's important to recognize that for a long time it really worked well, and that it made sense. I think a lot of people right now, especially in DC, in think tank world, in kind of the parts of universities that deal with sort of geopolitics, there's a sort of, people are not happy about the situation, to put it bluntly. And I understand that, and there's some logic to that. But, for a long time, we were playing a very efficient game. And in the list of things that, are the downsides to China's system that Mitch added to, or you could put it as strengths in terms of its capacity to take pain and so forth, I would say inefficiency it has to be on that list too. And, I think we need to re-optimize, find the new optimal point for this new type of relationship. So when it was engagement and globalization kind of unchecked or almost unchecked was the direction it felt like things were going in, it made perfect sense in a way to not have, to not try and to not be protectionist, right? To not introduce all of these kind of non-market inefficiencies and irrational elements into our economic, our company's economic agendas and business plans, because, that didn't make sense. China wasn't always playing that game. And as Mitch said, it was foolish to think it ever might have. Now that the whole world is kind of readjusting and pushing back, I think the real challenge now is to not overcorrect. We need to correct, right? We're not going back to sort of full open, no borders, globalization, the world is flat. But we don't want to lose a lot of the good stuff that came with that. And I think, going back again to the political comparison, China moves by overcorrection, right? The Chinese state has never done anything in a delicate or sort of gracious way. It speaks obnoxiously, it acts obnoxiously. Nothing it does. For a culture that is so accomplished and wise and civilized in terms of subtlety, and the language, and people who go to China, that's inescapable, and everything is layered and contextual. The state is then just this behemoth block that is just moving in this crude way. The U.S. doesn't need to be that way, and if we try and emulate that, we're not going to win. So we're moving, but we don't want to shift too fast. That's what China does. So I think there really is sort of, we can reclaim a lot of lost ground. But it's just, we need to stay clear-eyed and not give up too much toward protectionism, national security, and so forth. Those are real concerns, but it's not the be-all and end-all, and we need to put it in perspective.
Yeah, not only that, but I'll just add one more thing. If people keep insisting that China's falling off a cliff, it not only justifies impractical policies, because people believe, if we can just be tough enough, then China will collapse, or it'll become like we want it to become. So these narratives that China is on the verge of collapse are actually quite helpful to Chinese interests, actually. There's that, you once in a while will hear people talk about, anything other than the hawkish argument is somehow being a useful idiot to Beijing. And I would argue that, impractical policies have done more harm to U.S. interests than almost anything else that China has done. I mean, far worse than IP theft and the other things. I formed the China Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition, which was the body which was created to help American multinationals fight product counterfeiting. And everyone from Boeing to Coca-Cola and Nike was a member. They're still in business. I mean, it's still an existing entity. And I can tell you that it was never formed with the idea that we were going to get China to follow the rules. We only knew that we were going to engage them in ways that we could turn impractical policies into pragmatic policies. And that's the theme for the day we're in right now, that practitioners like Aaron and myself, who have spent a lot of time, I lived in China for 30 years. I speak, read, and write Chinese. He speaks, read, and writes Chinese. He's spent a lot of time on the ground. This is what's missing. There are I'll just give you an example on rare earths. There are 24 Americans that can talk about rare earths. There are 100,000 members of the Chinese Rare Earths Society. I mean, you just can't imagine the difference in scale. There are less than 10,000, at the peak, there were less than 10,000 Americans studying in China. China has 270,000 students studying in the United States. And now it's considered somehow a demark if people from the U.S. have spent too much time in China, because it might be harder for them to get security clearances and everything else. This does not encourage the kind of on-the-ground understanding that we need to supplement all the theoretical and all of the, the hawkish ideas. You have to infuse all of those ideas with doses of reality. There are 4 schools of existing thought on China. Aaron and I are part of the creation of the formalization of a 5th school, the practitioner scholar school on China, where, yes, we're practitioners. Aaron's a scholar, I'm a practitioner, but we both cross over. And that's what's missing, that 5th lens that will help bring the entire picture into clear relief. That's what is needed now. Not saying that the hawks are wrong, but by themselves, left to their own devices, without the pragmatic on-the-ground experience from people who actually know how to get things done in China and are not doves and don't really find that all the hawks' ideas are so terrible. But those ideas left to their own devices without pragmatism infused in will be just another decade of disaster. And we can't afford that. We're already facing relegation, and it's not something we want to continue.
I'll be the 3rd member of your school. As someone who had that strike close to home, I was on Boeing on the digital leadership board, so we definitely saw a lot of that. So, but I will be the 3rd member of your school. I think I want to pull a thread out from something that you both mentioned earlier. So we're talking about the U.S. perspective on things, and, definitely there needs to be pragmatic adjustments, clearly. I think it doesn't make sense to vilify, either a cooperative lens or even the hawkish lens. That's my approach, because they both have merit. But again, I think this will be a fun question, because you can both offer unique perspectives as, an owl, and then I'm not sure, maybe you're what is more of a business type bird. It's, I would love to hear it. So clearly everyone in this group has deep experience in China. And the thread that I want to pull from earlier is we mentioned that, at the high levels of senior leadership in Chinese policy, there is this belief that the U.S. is falling off of the deep end. I mean, what's going on there? Because I feel like both of you can offer really fun insights.
About the Chinese
on the Chinese side. The Chinese side, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's a story, it's so hard. As I was just in Beijing earlier June, in the middle of June, and I gave a talk on the Iran war and sort of U.S. foreign policy and American society and politics, and kind of what the Iran war means for all this. It's at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So it was a great opportunity to sort of have some frank and open conversations. And, I think in the same way that for them, so to speak, it's so hard to imagine just the kind of base level chaos, unpredictability, complexity, contradictoriness of American society and decision making. And you have within the Trump, I mean, just, and it's not unique even to Trump, but the current political leadership, right? You have, people who are totally in favor of, the war and totally opposed to the war. And it's like, which is it? And then, oh, there must be some conspiracy. And there's not a conspiracy. It's just that's a kind of complexity and contradictoriness that because we live here and just have no choice but to accept it, we do. And I think we need to do the exact same thing for China. And it's like, yes, you have Xi Jinping talking about China's strengths and kind of hinting. I mean, there was a lot of sensationalizing of what he actually said. But in any case, let's just take the kind of caricatured version and say, yes, he talked about the decline of the West. There's also deep, deep paranoia and insecurity on the Chinese part. And, my own view based on time spent in, rural China, in very poor, underdeveloped parts of the country is, that basically 9 out of the 10 problems that Xi Jinping wakes up every morning and is freaked out about, one of them is international, right? And more often than not, maybe it has to do with, the U.S. or NATO or Taiwan or something, but like the vast majority of his headspace is still dealing with the domestic situation. And China is not, in the same way that the United States, we have a very confident culture, but also we feel totally insecure at the moment. I think basically the same thing is true about China, and even more so. And frankly, they have a lot of development problems that we don't actually have in this country. And there are many problems in the United States too. I'm not trying to say that we don't have problems, but, just to drive home the point that I don't think there's a lot of sort of stock put in this, we're going to roll the dice now because we know that history is on our side. I think if anything, we have to make sure, it's almost, we have to make sure that it continues to feel every day that maybe history will eventually lean to our side, and therefore we can't take any risks, and we have to be very sort of cautious. It's a very risk-averse regime and a very risk-averse time in its history, right? Because right now, also just to put it in context, next year we have the next party Congress. Xi Jinping probably, it seems like we'll take a fourth term, and so. This is not a time when he's looking to rock the boat any more than it needs to be rocked. So I don't think we should let their overconfidence be political rhetoric, which is a lot of what it is, and not read too much into it and psychologize them beyond that.
Yeah, and also keep in mind that they don't believe their own propaganda at the highest levels either. They're under no illusions. They know exactly. Their economy is, I just mentioned a Rorschach test, but I'm going to throw another one out at you. I think that the Chinese economy specifically is kind of a Schrodinger's cat. You don't know whether it's alive or dead. So you have to assume it exists in both states simultaneously. It's in a quantum state. And that's the only way you can do it, because the institutional economy is actually kicking ass in China. If you look at their ability to dominate new industries, 2 years ago it was battery storage, and then it was EVs, and then it was AI, and now it'll be something else. Robotics. Did you watch the Super Bowl? We were doing something that was like reminiscent of like 1970s celebration of cultures. And China, they had robots dancing on a stage during the CCTV1 Chunjie, show, which is watched by 700 million people. And that was robots dancing in unison, celebrating their digital future. It was very, very different. You can look at the different visions for Chinese culture and our culture, and you can see the real separation isn't capitalism versus communism or democracy versus authoritarianism. It's collectivism versus individualism, okay? It's do we fundamentally believe that the individual is more important than the group, or do we fundamentally believe that the group's more important than the individual? Here's the argument in favor of the group being more important than the individual. It's how nature operates. It's how nature has always operated. What we're doing is separate from that. It's something we think is an evolution of that. But there's no other examples in history or in nature of the individualist model surviving. Their model happens to do very well. If you can put the needs of the individual down low, you can do a lot of things. Now, Aaron mentioned, the rural economy. China's always operated with dichotomies and dualities. You have the individualism, kind of being subsumed by collectivism, but you also have the idea that the individual economy, the consumer economy, the white collar work, job market, and those kinds of things are suffering greatly. But the institutional economy, the state-owned enterprises, R&D, leading research universities, military, and all of that connected up to like 4 or 5 national objectives that everybody gets aligned around. And then local governments, they act as VCs, so that, if EVs are announced as one of the top Chinese goals, then every little province, is going to have their little VC fund, and they're going to deploy in. And that's why you have over 100 EV companies in China, because whether or not this company in this province or this company in that province wins, China wins. And that's the goal for them. So they're very willing to play that kind of a game. When it comes to their relations with the global South, I think that they're playing a very sophisticated game, and it runs all the way back to their earliest dynasties, where they, operate under a tributary state model. It's very different from the vassal state model. Vassals were basically allowed autonomy, but don't get too crazy. We run things. China was a little more elegant about how they operated. They actually did treat a local king like an equal to the emperor, but the Chinese emperor would only give 1 goat to the Turkmenistan, king, and then the Turkmenistan king would give 10,000, tons of rice. So, everyone's equal, but some are more equal than others. And I think that you're going to see a lot of these old playbook things coming out. And that's why, of the 4 schools of theoretical Chinese studies, I believe the most important of all is not the political economy school, which is popular amongst think tanks, or the elite politics school, which is very popular amongst hawks, looking at everything through the lens of the standing committee and Xi and what's he had for breakfast and how does he feel today. The one that really matters is the civilizational historical school, which was actually formed here at Harvard, at the Fairbanks Center. By John King Fairbank, and now is the Fairbanks Center, where I'm still located, is kind of its resting home. That school is going to be the one that really matters now, because understanding China in historical context is going to illuminate a lot of questions that people in Washington are having a hard time understanding, because they don't really believe that history is that important, because our history is not really part of our day-to-day strategy conversations. We don't talk about China competition in 2026 and look back at something that happened in, 1810 and say, oh, we're able to pull some interesting lessons from that. But China does. China will sit in meetings with you and talk about something that happened during the Shang or the Yuan, and they'll talk about it in terms of it as if it just happened, and it's their living history. And I think that's something that, again, pragmatism, pragmatists, owls, objectivity, these are the themes that are going to define, we think, the next phase of this competition. And maybe we're just the messengers on that. But I think one way or the other, that's where things are going to go. And whether the hawks in Washington make that easier or harder determines how quickly we can start to get on that, because it's not going to happen any other way. And it won't work out as well for the U.S. in any other configuration.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was trying to understand certain business strategies when I was looking at China-headed multinational corporations. I've been on both the sides of business, I've been on policy, and I was trying to understand it more deeply, but it's just like you said, it points back to these kind of civilization starting stories and theories. We have the asymmetric warfare, Sun Tzu, so forth, so on. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Jumping to round everything up, again, there are so many things we could talk about. I'm wondering, just on terms of what's on top of both of your minds, besides this lovely paper that you published with great recommendations, if you could give some type of takeaway or actionable recommendation either to policymakers or multinational companies, predominantly on the U.S. side, what recommendation would you give? I'm just looking at you to solve all the problems right now, but what would you want people to take away as we move forward?
I have one, but I'm happy to go second.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, we're working on something, another paper on this now, but don't underestimate the leverage. This is to American firms and multinationals. Don't underestimate the leverage that we have right now, because and the value of the opportunity, because for all the strengths that we've recognized on the Chinese side, that at least the three of us here are willing to see and acknowledge, um, the Chinese model is not changing. They are still going to be a kind of export manufacturing driven growth. And that means they are hungry for the American market. They're hungry for many markets, and we shouldn't be arrogant or think that, oh, if they don't have access to the American market, the regime is going to collapse tomorrow, which is something that was being said just about a year ago, but, at sort of in around the first, tariff spat of the second Trump administration. But that doesn't mean that they're not rational actors and are not trying their best to grow. And they're struggling to grow domestically because of China's weak domestic consumption and demand. So that really means that, like, American firms looking to do to Chinese firms what Chinese firms did to the United States in decades past really have an opportunity. So don't let the sobering realism of what we're saying get in the way of recognizing actually the huge opportunity that's also in front of us if we make the right moves as a country and as a society.
Yeah, we're either going to reindustrialize with China's help or without China's help. Industrializing without China's help is going to be extremely costly. It's going to be very time consuming. I'm not sure we have the political unity to pull it off. We certainly don't have the ability to call in the Fortune 1000 and demand they sit at a table and work with U.S. government agencies to figure out the solutions here. So, I mean, the better way is to get our head around the idea of a relative risk frame, which is, instead of looking at EVs and whether there's a 1% shot that we could become dependent on China, or even a 20% shot or a 50% shot that we become dependent on China for some, components or something like that, or that they might weaponize those EVs. You can work around risk without accepting those risks. But you also have to acknowledge, if you're going to look at the risk of doing something like cooperating with China on EVs, say joint venture manufacturing on American soil, then you have to be willing to look at the risk of not doing that, which is we could be forced into permanent relegation, where we're always on the outside looking in on the Chinese EV supply chains, on the advanced manufacturing that's going to define the quality of products going forward. Even Germans cannot compete against Chinese automakers anymore. I mean, and the Germans were our best. They were our most precise, best engineered performance vehicles, and even they're getting worked, not just in China, but around the world now. And so we have to start understanding this relative risk mindset. If there was one thing I could wish for in Washington, is that they move out of this absolute risk mindset, which is defined, they're thinking since we just had our 250th, since we were formed as a nation, and it's time we evolve out of that. We are not going to win this competition or even stay at par with China if we don't.
Excellent. I mean, I think this was an amazing conversation. I will definitely highlight those takeaways, because we are at a critical time where, action needs to be taken. I feel like we've been largely reactive in this, current political environment. And we see this even on the business side. Everyone has to be hedging for geopolitical risk. So if we can be more proactive, it makes sense. I am very excited for your upcoming paper. I will keep an eye out for it, but also feel free to ping me. It has been lovely having you both on the podcast, and I feel like this was a very productive conversation. So yes, definitely open invite to come back. Would love to hear about your upcoming paper. When's it going to come out?
Hopefully in a couple of weeks. We'll keep you posted.
Yes, please do. Fascinating. I was taking notes during the discussion of some articles that I want to, it was just so, thought provoking. But yes, can we have a hint what the title is, or is that still
Well, the one in question that I just referred to is
Yeah.
title. Editors usually pick the title, so I won't
Hmm.
I
Okay.
won't venture a guess on that. But basically, it's talking about the opportunity of the current moment and the leverage that American firms may actually have because of where joint ventures actually sit in
Mm.
China's strategy. And we look at it at a couple of geopolitically, economically, in terms of China's political system, even, and trying to actually get a rational look instead of just saying like, oh, China would never do anything that would help the United States. Like, again, going back to the theme we discussed earlier of mirroring and projection, like, actually, there might be a situation when China says, we think it's worth it because we need these certain developments and our economy is in the situation. So it's worth it, even if there's an upside for the United States. And, so that is kind of the attitude also that we are advocating to bring back here.
Amazing. Well, you heard it here first, and we will wait in rapt, attention for your paper to come out. But yes, thank you both so much for joining the podcast. I hope you both have a wonderful rest of your day and summer. And yes, more soon.